should have stayed home on New Year's Eve. Going to my grandmother's house in the countryside was a last-minute decision. One of those sudden plans that adults make when teenagers have no say in the matter. My parents wanted to spend New Year's Eve alone, and I, a 17-year-old boy who was considered adult, was sent to live with my grandmother in a remote, run-down cabin. The village was several hours' drive from anything resembling civilization, deep in the forest, and cut off from the world in winter. I stared out the frost-covered bus window as we sped along an endless road surrounded by skeletal trees. Their branches scratched the sky, barren and black against the slate-gray clouds. Snow covered the ground, fresh and untouched, turning the landscape into a dead silent expanse. As we approached the village, the houses became fewer and farther apart, each older and darker than the last. When I finally got off the bus, the air bit into my skin, sharp and unforgiving. Grandma's house stood on the edge of the village, behind a shabby wooden fence and a narrow path where snow lay. It looked smaller than I remembered, and hunched over like a wounded animal. The faded shutters hung askew, and the roof sagged under the weight of the snow. A faint smoke rose from the chimney, assuring me that at least it was warm inside. Grandma greeted me at the door with her usual thin-lipped smile. Her arms, veined and knotted like tree roots, held me tightly before leading me into the house. The warmth inside descended on me like a wall, carrying the smell of old wood, dried herbs, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something earthy and metallic. The house hadn't changed much. It was still cluttered with various pieces of furniture, shelves of dusty books, and a collection of odd trinkets my grandmother had collected over the years. Knitting needles clicked as usual, lying on the arm of her favorite chair, surrounded by balls of dull yarn. A single candle burned on the dining table, casting long shadows on the walls. The first few hours passed uneventfully. My grandmother poured me a bowl of steaming soup, her movements precise and deliberate, as if she had done it 1,000 times. She said nothing, just the usual questions about school and my parents. I put it down to her being old and used to it, but something about her was not right. Her smile seemed forced, and her eyes lingered on me for a second longer. Throughout the day, I had tried to shake off the anxiety that had settled in my chest. I told myself that it was just the isolation, the silence that seemed too loud, that the trees seemed to lean closer when the wind blew. I kept telling myself that, even as night fell and the house seemed to hold its breath, the shadows in the corners grew darker and deeper, and the hours dragged on. And for the first time in years, I felt like a child afraid of the dark again. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The first night was restless. Despite the warmth of the thick blankets that my grandmother threw over the bed, it was not easy to fall asleep. The room I was staying in was small, its single window frozen shut, and the furniture sparse: a bed, a nightstand, and an old wardrobe that seemed to hang over the room like a silent guardian. The silence was the worst part. In the city, there is always some background noise. Cars, voices, humming electricity. Here, the silence was like a weight, broken only by the occasional creak of an old house or the distant howl of the wind. I lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, my mind wandering. My grandmother's behavior did not give me peace. She seemed distracted, as if her mind was somewhere else. I tried to convince myself that it just seemed normal for her to act a little strange. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Sometime after midnight, I was woken up by a sound. It was faint but distinct, a rhythmic creaking sound, like the groaning of old floorboards under deliberate, heavy weight. I froze, straining my ears. The sound was coming from the hallway, slowly and measuredly, moving toward my room. My heart started pounding so loudly that I was sure it would give me away. I told myself that it was just my grandmother checking on me. She probably couldn't sleep either. But when the creaking stopped outside my door, I realized that I wasn't so sure. The door did not open. The silence stretched on, suffocating. For a moment, I thought about calling someone, but my throat was dry, and a deep instinct told me to remain silent. After what seemed like an eternity, the creaking started again, this time moving away. I waited for the sound to completely subside before I dared to breathe. Morning came, dull and gray, but it brought little comfort. When I woke up, my grandmother was already in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared breakfast. She had her back to me, but there was something disturbing about the way she moved. Her gestures were too precise and her posture too rigid. When she finally turned to face me, her smile was wide, almost unnatural. Her eyes locked on mine, and for a moment I saw something in them that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was not warmth or recognition, but something colder. As the day went on, her behavior became stranger and stranger. She would mumble under her breath when she thought I wasn't listening, her words too quiet to make out. At one point, I noticed that she was staring at a spot on the wall, her lips moving as if in prayer or in conversation with someone who wasn't there. The house also felt different. The air seemed heavier, the shadows longer. Even the trees outside the window seemed to have gathered closer, their bare branches almost touching the glass. By evening, I could not shake the growing feeling of fear. My grandmother's eccentricities were no longer just eccentricities. They were deliberate, purposeful, as if she were following some invisible script. That night, lying in bed, I vowed not to sleep. I needed to understand what was happening, to convince myself that I wasn't imagining it. And when the squeaking repeated, I realized that I was awake. This time the creaking was louder, each step deliberate and unhurried. I lay absolutely still, clutching the edge of the blanket as if it could protect me from whatever was behind the door. The sound was getting closer, and my pulse quickened with each slow, measured groan of the floorboards. When the footsteps stopped, I braced myself for the door to open. The silence dragged on, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock in the corridor. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually I gathered the courage to lean my head toward the door. It was ajar, not wide, just a crack, enough for a patch of darkness to seep into the room. My breath caught in my throat as I stared through the narrow gap, straining my eyes against the shadows. And then I saw it, a face, or at least I thought it was a face. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but there was something there, pale and still, hanging on the edge of the door frame. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared. Every instinct was screaming at me to close my eyes, to hide, to pretend I didn't see it. But I couldn't look away. My body froze, caught in a silent confrontation with what was standing there. And then, slowly, the door began to close. The pale figure disappeared into the dark corridor, and the soft click of the latch broke the spell. I waited, my heart pounding, but there were no more sounds. The rest of the night passed in a fog of fear and fatigue. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to the faint daylight coming through the frosted window. My limbs were numb, and my mind was clouded with memories of what I had seen or thought I had seen. When I went to the kitchen, my grandmother was already there, stirring something on the stove. She greeted me with the same overly broad smile, her eyes lingering on me just a moment longer than they should have. "You look pale," she said, her voice calm, almost cheerful. "Didn't get enough sleep?" I shook my head, unable to form words. She turned back to the stove, her movements nervously smooth. Throughout the day, I tried to convince myself that it was a dream. I even looked out into the hallway, looking at the floorboards to see if there were any signs of movement. But everything looked normal, except a little worn from time to time. Still, I couldn't shake the anxiety. My grandmother's mumbling was getting louder, her behavior more erratic. She would spend long stretches of time in her room with the door closed, coming out only to eat or mutter something before disappearing again. As the sun began to set, the house felt different. The air was heavier, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed alive and moving in ways they shouldn't have. That night I locked the door, but the creaking came back, louder than ever. The creaking began earlier that night, just as the last light of day faded from the window. I sat on the edge of the bed, my back against the cold wall, listening as the sound moved through the hallway. It was different this time. It wasn't the slow, measured pace of footsteps, but an erratic shuffle, punctuated by heavy thuds. It didn't stop outside my door. Instead, it moved back and forth, pacing the length of the hallway. The sound went on for what felt like hours, growing louder and more frantic. Every so often, there was a faint tapping, like fingernails raking against the walls. My hands trembled as I clutched the blanket, my eyes fixed on the locked door. Suddenly, the pacing stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then came the sound of breathing, heavy and labored, just beyond the door. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. The handle rattled. It wasn't a tentative jiggle but a violent, desperate shaking, as though someone or something was trying to break in. I bit down hard on my lip to keep from screaming, the metallic taste of blood flooding my mouth. Then came the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. But it grew louder, a low, guttural chant in a language I couldn't understand. The voice was hoarse, strained, and it didn't sound like Grandma. The rattling stopped, and the whispering faded into the silence. But the sense of dread lingered, thick and suffocating. I didn't dare move, even as the hours stretched on and the first rays of dawn crept into the room. When morning came, the house was eerily quiet. I unlocked the door with shaking hands, half expecting to find scratch marks or some sign of the night's events. But the hallway was pristine, as though nothing had happened. Grandma was in the kitchen again, humming softly as she chopped vegetables. She didn't acknowledge me when I entered, her focus entirely on the rhythmic slice of the knife against the cutting board. Her hands moved with unnatural precision, the knife flashing in the pale morning light. The sound of the blade hitting the wood was sharp and relentless, filling the room with an oppressive rhythm. As I watched her, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Her hands. The skin was mottled, darker than it had been the day before, and her knuckles were swollen and raw, as though she'd been clawing at something. I couldn't bring myself to ask about it. Instead, I spent the day wandering the village, desperate for a distraction. But even outside, the unease followed me. The villagers were polite but distant, their conversations clipped and guarded. They avoided eye contact, their faces lined with a kind of weary apprehension. When I mentioned Grandma's name to a shopkeeper, his expression darkened. He muttered something about the old ways and hurried me out of the store, leaving me with more questions than answers. By the time I returned to the house, the sun was already setting. Grandma was nowhere to be seen, but the door to her room was ajar, and from inside, I heard the whispering again. The hallway stretched before me, quiet and dim, but the faint sound of whispering seeped into the silence like a sinister thread. It came from Grandma's room, low and guttural, the cadence uneven yet purposeful. The door was ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Every instinct told me to turn back, to retreat to the safety of my locked room, but something compelled me forward. My steps were slow and hesitant, the old floorboards creaking beneath my weight. As I approached the door, the air grew colder, the sharp tang of earth and iron stinging my nose. I pushed the door open, its hinges groaning in protest, and was immediately struck by the scene inside. The room was shrouded in shadows, its only illumination a single candle placed on the floor. The flickering light cast distorted shapes on the walls, where dark, crude symbols had been scrawled in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. In the center of the room, Grandma knelt motionless. Her back was hunched, her thin frame silhouetted against the candle's glow. Her head was bowed, her hands resting on the floor in front of her, and her lips moved incessantly as she chanted in a language I couldn't recognize. The symbols seemed alive in the candlelight, their edges pulsing faintly as though reacting to her words. A crude circle was drawn on the floor, its jagged lines irregular and smeared. Inside it lay an assortment of objects, a bundle of twigs tied with red thread, a small animal skull, and a shard of something that caught the light like polished stone. I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether she had noticed me. But then, her chant faltered, and her body stiffened. Slowly, she raised her head, though she didn't turn to look at me. The sudden stillness in the room was suffocating, and I realized I was holding my breath. Without warning, her hands reached for the bundle of twigs. She held it above the candle, her movements deliberate, and resumed chanting, faster and louder this time. The flame leapt high, its light bathing the room in an unnatural brightness that stung my eyes. A sudden crackling noise filled the air, sharp and chaotic, and I stumbled backward as the candle's flame surged once more before snuffing out completely. The room plunged into darkness, the whispering silenced, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and something metallic. I blinked, trying to adjust to the blackness. My eyes searched the room, but Grandma was gone. The symbols on the walls now emitted a faint, pulsing glow, their shapes shifting as though they were alive. Before I could fully process what I'd seen, a loud, deliberate knock echoed from the front of the house. The sound was followed by another, and then another, each one more forceful. My pulse quickened as I stumbled out of the room and down the stairs. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure whether to approach the door or run. Then, from the darkness behind me, the faintest whisper reached my ears. It wasn't over yet. The house felt impossibly still after the knocking ceased, as though it were holding its breath. I stood in the entryway, every muscle tense, waiting for something to happen. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of wood as the old house settled around me. Turning slowly, I scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. The glow from the symbols in Grandma's room still pulsed faintly, their shapes casting an eerie light that stretched into the hallway. It felt as though the house itself was alive, watching me with unseen eyes. The windows along the front of the house caught my attention. At first glance, the frosted glass reflected only darkness, but as I moved closer, I noticed shapes shifting just beyond the snow-covered panes. They weren't clear, more like silhouettes, faint and indistinct. I hesitated, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The shapes outside didn't move naturally. They seemed to sway, as if caught in a wind I couldn't feel. Their presence felt wrong, an intrusion into the quiet isolation of the night. A sudden thud from behind made me spin around. Something heavy had fallen, though I couldn't see what it was. The sound came from upstairs, where the faint glow from Grandma's room still illuminated the edges of the dark hallway. Summoning every ounce of courage, I climbed the staircase, each step creaking beneath my weight. The house felt colder with every step, the chill seeping into my bones. At the top of the stairs, the door to Grandma's room was wide open. The light from the symbols had dimmed to a faint shimmer, but the air still carried a strange energy, as though the room itself was vibrating with something I couldn't hear. I stepped inside cautiously, my eyes adjusting to the dim glow. The circle on the floor was now empty, the objects that had been inside it gone. The candle was a pool of hardened wax, its flame long extinguished. My gaze was drawn to the walls. The symbols were no longer still. They writhed and twisted, their shapes contorting like living things trying to escape the surface. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest, something moved. It wasn't Grandma. This figure was taller, its limbs too long and its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It didn't step forward, but its presence filled the room, oppressive and overwhelming. Couldn't look away. My body refused to obey the primal urge to flee, leaving me rooted in place as the figure shifted closer, though it didn't seem to walk. It simply was, its form stretching and bending as though the shadows themselves were its skin. Just as the pressure in the room became unbearable, a sound broke the tension. A soft, deliberate tap from the window behind me. I turned sharply, the spell broken, and saw the same shifting silhouettes outside. They were closer now, their movements synchronized, their forms pressing against the glass as if trying to seep through it. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it became a pounding that reverberated through the entire house. My pulse raced as I stumbled down the stairs, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was happening. As I reached the bottom step, the pounding stopped. Silence descended once more, thicker and more unnerving than before. The air was heavy, charged with an electric tension that made it hard to breathe. And then, From somewhere deep within the house came a faint, raspy breath. The sound was faint at first, like a soft wheeze escaping from the old bones of the house. It wasn't steady. It came in erratic bursts, a wet and labored rasp that seemed to seep through the very walls. I froze at the base of the stairs, every hair on my body standing on end. The breath grew louder, closer, as though it were moving toward me from somewhere unseen. My chest tightened as I strained to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to echo from every corner of the house, surrounding me. The front door loomed ahead, its chipped paint pale in the dim light. For a fleeting moment, I considered running, throwing it open and plunging into the snow-covered darkness outside. But the memory of the shifting shapes at the window stopped me cold. Whatever waited out there was no safer than what lingered inside. The rasping sound shifted again, this time coming from below. My stomach churned as I realized it was coming from the crawlspace beneath the house. The sound rose and fell, uneven and distorted, like a dying animal struggling to breathe. I turned toward the source, my steps unsteady as I moved down the hallway. The air grew colder with each step, the boards beneath my feet groaning in protest. The entrance to the crawlspace was a small, warped door set into the floor at the far end of the hallway. The door's edges were darkened with age, its hinges rusted. The faint breathing continued behind it, rising and falling in an almost rhythmic pattern, as though whatever was beneath the house was waiting, listening. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I reached for the metal latch. It was ice cold to the touch, biting into my fingers as I gripped it. Slowly, I lifted the latch, the sound of metal scraping against wood breaking the oppressive silence. The door creaked open, revealing a black void below. The smell hit me immediately, a sickly, damp odor of earth and decay that made my stomach lurch. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but I could just make out the outline of a narrow passage leading deeper into the foundation of the house. The breathing was louder now, reverberating through the confined space. It felt alive, pulsating like the beat of a monstrous heart. I leaned closer, my pulse thundering in my ears, when something moved within the shadows. It was subtle at first, a shift of darkness that made me doubt my own eyes. But then it came again, a deliberate, slithering motion, followed by the faintest scrape of something hard against the packed dirt floor. I stumbled back, my chest tightening with panic. The breathing quickened, matching the erratic pace of my own, and for a horrifying moment, it felt as though it were mimicking me, drawing closer with every shaky inhale I took. I slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. The rasping stopped abruptly, leaving the air thick with an unnatural silence. I stumbled away from the crawlspace, my legs barely carrying me to the living room. The air felt heavier than ever, pressing down on me as though the house itself was trying to smother me. The windows in the room were dark, but I could still feel the presence of the shapes outside, their silent movements a constant reminder that I was surrounded. And then, from somewhere deep within the walls, came a faint scratching sound. The scratching was subtle at first, almost delicate, like the faint scrape of nails against wood. It came from all around me, weaving through the silence of the house, and it sent an icy chill down my spine. I stood motionless in the living room, my ears straining to track the sound. It started in one corner, then shifted to another, moving through the walls like something alive. The erratic rhythm made it impossible to predict, but it never stopped. The living room, once cluttered but comforting, now felt like a trap. The flickering light from the single candle on the mantel cast uneven shadows that danced across the faded wallpaper. The air was so cold now that my breath fogged in front of me, and every shallow exhale seemed unnaturally loud. The scratching intensified, growing louder and more frantic. It was everywhere, above, below, beside me, as if the walls themselves were alive, writhing with unseen things trying to claw their way out. I backed away from the center of the room, my movements jerky and unsteady. My legs brushed against a low table, and the sound of the wood scraping against the floor made me jump. The scratching immediately ceased, plunging the house into a silence so profound it felt deafening. The stillness was worse than the noise. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I waited, frozen in place, for the next sound. Seconds stretched into an eternity before it came. A slow, deliberate creak from upstairs. I turned toward the staircase, my gaze locked on the top where shadows pooled like spilled ink. The creak came again, the sound unmistakable. Something was moving. It wasn't just a shift of weight on the old boards. It was heavy, deliberate, each step purposeful as it moved closer to the top of the stairs. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't look away. The candlelight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shape, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, at the edge of the darkness. I stumbled backward, my legs barely carrying me to the hallway. The air felt denser now, almost suffocating, and the temperature continued to drop. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I pressed my back against the wall. From upstairs, the sound stopped. The silence was absolute, stretching out for several agonizing moments. Just as I began to hope it was over, a new noise emerged, soft, wet, and labored. It was the breathing again, but this time it was closer, as though the walls themselves were exhaling around me. The floor beneath my feet vibrated faintly, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with the sound. My heart raced as I realized the breathing wasn't coming from a specific direction. It was everywhere, surrounding me, and then, from the far end of the hallway, came a faint glow. At first, I thought it was the symbols in Grandma's room flaring to life again, but this light was different. It was dim and flickering, like the dying embers of a fire, and it seemed to seep out of the very walls. The light grew stronger, casting strange shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. The scratching returned, louder and more chaotic, as though whatever had been lurking in the walls was now desperate to escape. I turned to run, my body acting on pure instinct, but the moment I moved, the breathing shifted, no longer distant and diffuse but right behind me. I bolted down the hallway, my feet slipping on the old, warped floorboards as the house seemed to come alive around me. The scratching in the walls grew deafening, a maddening cacophony that filled every corner of the house. The breathing, now guttural and labored, followed close behind, as if some unseen force was giving chase. The flickering glow from Grandma's room spilled into the hallway, twisting the shadows into grotesque shapes that lunged and recoiled like living things. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look at the walls or the places where darkness pooled. When I reached the living room, the air was thick with the stench of damp earth and rot. The candle on the mantel had gone out, plunging the room into near-total darkness. The only light came from the windows, where the pale forms outside pressed against the glass, their movements frantic and unnatural. I stumbled to the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. My fingers slipped on the cold metal, and the pounding in the walls grew louder, as though the house itself was protesting my escape. The lock finally gave, and I threw the door open. The freezing night air hit me like a wall, and for a moment, I hesitated. The shapes outside had stopped moving, their featureless forms eerily still. They stood in a semicircle, their heads tilted in unison as if watching me. Before I could step outside, a deep, guttural groan erupted from the crawlspace beneath the house. It was unlike anything I'd heard before, a sound that resonated deep in my chest, primal and otherworldly. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and the floorboards buckled as though something massive was stirring below. I turned back toward the hallway, and for the first time, I saw it. It wasn't human, or at least not anymore. Its elongated limbs and distorted features were a grotesque mockery of a human form, its flesh pale and stretched taut over impossibly long bones. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its empty eye sockets seemed to burn with a dim, flickering light. It moved toward me with an unnatural grace, its limbs folding and unfolding like a spider's. The symbols on the walls flared to life as it passed, their glow pulsing in time with its movements. I stumbled backward, the icy night air biting into my skin. The thing hesitated at the threshold, its distorted form shuddering as though it couldn't cross the boundary. The shapes outside began to move again, their faceless heads turning in unison toward me. I was trapped between the two terrors, unsure which was worse. The standoff was unbearable. The thing in the house twitched and spasmed, its long fingers clawing at the air just beyond the doorway. The shapes outside swayed and circled, their movements synchronized and deliberate, as though they were waiting for something. The groaning from beneath the house grew louder, a sound so deep it seemed to shake the very foundation. The pressure in the air was overwhelming, and my ears rang with a high-pitched whine. I don't know what compelled me to look back at the house one last time. Maybe it was the faint memory of my grandmother, or maybe it was morbid curiosity. But when I turned, I saw her. She stood at the far end of the hallway, her frail figure illuminated by the pulsing glow of the symbols. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes burned with an unnatural light. She raised one hand slowly, pointing toward me, and the thing at the door shrieked. The sound was unbearable, piercing and raw, and I clapped my hands over my ears as I stumbled backward into the snow. The shapes outside surged forward, their movements frantic, but they didn't approach me. Instead, they converged on the house, their faceless forms pressing against the walls. The house shuddered violently, the symbols glowing brighter than ever before. The thing inside clawed at the doorway, its form twisting and writhing as it let out one final, ear-splitting scream. And then, with a deafening roar, the house collapsed in on itself. The walls buckled, the roof caved, and the symbols burned away in a blinding flash of light. When the dust settled, nothing remained but a smoldering pile of rubble. The shapes were gone, the night eerily quiet once more. I stood there in the snow, my breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the ruins. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the remains of the house. All I knew was that whatever had happened in that house, whatever my grandmother had unleashed, was over. But as the sun rose, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. A faint, rhythmic sound that echoed in my ears long after the house was gone. It was the sound of breathing,